Okay, so we did a analogy on biotoxicity, which is basically the effects of toxic things on living organisms. And so in this drawing, you can see that there is an island, and there are enemy armies and Navy and Air Force attacking it. And the army, which has 700 people, is it's too big to fit inside the barrier, so it's not able to inflict any damage or very little damage on the island itself. And the Navy, which has about 100 people, which is much less, is able to inflict more damage, but not as much, not quite a lot. And the Air Force, which has 450 soldiers in it, is able to inflict the most damage and is able to basically destroy the island.
The army represents silver powder that we use to attack the cell. So the barrier of the cell is the membrane of it. And so the army is too big to enter the cell because, like the powder, it's too big to actually inflict any damage onto the cell. And then the Navy represents ions because it is able to come into the cell through protein receptors because it has a charge like other proteins that are accepted into the cell. And it inflicts damage onto the cell itself, but not as much as the nanoparticles, which is represented as a helicopter, the Air Force. And it inflicts the most damage because nanoparticles have a lot of surface area, so they can put a lot of ions into one nanoparticle, and they enter the cell through a process called endocytosis. And so they inflict the most damage on the cell. So as you can see, it destroyed the most. And at the top, the legend says gray and silver, and that represents the army because gray and silver, it's that color because it accepts the longer wavelengths, which makes the particles bigger so it cannot enter the cell, versus the nanoparticles, which is light yellow, so it absorbs the shortest wavelength, violet, so it is small enough to actually enter the cell and inflict damage.
So we really liked this analogy that this person drew, and we really liked the drawing. We just had a few suggestions on how to make it even better than it already was. Firstly, we were just a little bit confused on the truck that's on the top right of the image, as you can see behind the army, and we just felt that it was a little confusing because it didn't have a really big purpose. The second thing was that we thought that they could add some more damage shown in the army panel on the bottom left, because although the army, which represents the powder, is not able to physically enter the cell, it still is able to inflict some damage, which we felt that they could maybe add a little bit more. And finally, we thought that they could add a full view of the Navy panel, of the full view of the island, so that we could compare the damage between the Navy and the Air Force. Thank you.
Okay, so we are open for questions. Okay, I'm going to start with a question. Okay, so you guys did a great job. So first off, you talked about, I came in 2 minutes late. Did you talk about, we're saying goods and bads and.
Yeah, so I told them before they were going to present that they should talk about what was good about the thing and then what they could do to enhance it.
So for everybody, if it's your picture, no analogy ever captures all of the physics of a system, because a cell is not an island and silver is attacking, but it's not an army. And so no analogy is ever, ever, ever perfect. That's intrinsic to the process. And pointing out where an analogy fails is not saying it's bad. It's just saying what are the limits of the analogy. So if it's your picture, don't feel bad. That's part of using a cartoon to describe science. It's always not quite right. So I would say my first question for you is, there's some great things about this analogy, and then there's some things that just are sort of fundamentally different than the real system. What is the biggest thing that's fundamentally different between this analogy and the real system? And the thing I'm thinking about involves scale.
So the tank itself and the Navy ship and the Air Force, in real life, they're relatively close to the same size, but silver ions are actually way smaller than nanoparticles, and nanoparticles are smaller than the powder. So they don't show as the different sizes of the forms of silver.
Yeah. So the real system varies by orders of magnitude. So you want to show like attack, and so you're using this analogy, but like an ant attack versus a military attack might be more similar to the real size differences between silver nanoparticles and powders and ions. Like, ants, rats, and actual ships are more close to the real sizes. So that's a limit to this kind of analogy. Okay, now other people have to answer. So, by the way, parents, you don't get to go to the reception unless you ask at least one question. So, who has a question?
I don't understand what the number of soldiers has to do with anything.
So basically, in the actual experiment, we have a cell, and there's these different ways that silver is trying to enter the cell to create oxygen radicals that basically destroy the cell membrane. So this, in the analogy, there's the different amount of soldiers is representing the different sizes of the silver that's entering. So for the Army, it's 700 soldiers, which is the largest amount of people like in the analogy, and the Army represents powder going in, trying to enter the cell, but it physically can't, so that's why it's like can't enter the walls. And the Navy, which represents the silver ions, is the smallest, which is why it has 100 soldiers. And the nanoparticles, which is the Air Force, has 450 soldiers, which is the second largest and the most effective because it can't enter the cell and still has more, and is still bigger and has more ions than the silver ions, which are smaller.
But the real system is probably 1, 10 to the 10th, and 10 to the 24, as opposed to differing by a factor of 7. So that was the question I was asking. The real differences in size are way bigger, and that's a limit to this analogy. But that was a perfect question. One more question? You guys talked about that. Is that somehow captured in this picture? You can talk about both the real system and whether any of it is captured in the picture.
So actually, in the actual experiment, the silver ions go through active transport in order to get into the cell. So I think we are assuming that the Navy can. It's like going through certain channels, but it just doesn't do enough damage as the Air Force does.
Okay. Any one other question?
Do you have any concept of the time that will invade or whatever?
Is there anything about time scale? Either, is there anything you want to say about time scale, or is there anything about time scale in the picture?
Sorry.
In general, this is a pretty fast process. So when we did the experiment, it usually took about maybe 5 or 6 minutes to see like real results from this. And how we did it was we had a manometer, and it had the carbon dioxide from the yeast that was being expelled from the yeast, and it was moving water that was in the tube, and you could measure, and that happened fairly quickly.
So is that captured at all in the picture?
Not really.
So, but then I can ask a different question. This is always a question, so be warned if you're thinking, is there a way you could imagine adding that to the picture that would capture some differences in time scale?
Yeah, like you can put like after 10 minutes, like above the Navy or below like where it says Navy, you can put like after 15 minutes of attacking, so you can actually say how long they attacked to show how the time scale. So you can just add that.
Yeah, or you could have things that move. You could intrinsically make the delivery vehicles, some be slow or some be fast. So you could build it into the things that are attacking, make to reflect that time scale. That's probably the more intuitive way to build it into the cartoon itself. Okay, we should move on. Thank you guys for doing an awesome first presentation, and good job, audience.